What's up, fellow naughty steppers? It's that time of year again. December's here, Christmas is here, but more importantly, it's time for the favourites of 2017. This is the first of a small series that I'm going to be doing in the next few days on my favourites of the year. Generally, I'd say I don't think I've enjoyed music from the electronic bass scene as much as I have in previous years, but having said that, there have still been some incredible tracks that have been released this year, and I'm going to be talking to you about those today. So I tried to make this list have as much variety as possible, and I've done so by ensuring that no one artist can have more than one song on the list. The result of this being that I have covered almost 10 subgenres in this list, as you will see in the coming minutes. I've also made the rule that there can be no two songs from one compilation, so even if they were from different artists, I just wanted to keep the variety up as much as possible. And I must stress more than anything that this is solely one opinion, my opinion. I'm not giving anything objective about these songs. It's just how they make me feel, what I enjoy about them, how I feel they could possibly have been improved upon in places. It's more that they are my favourites, you know, the ones that I have enjoyed most out of the hundreds, potentially thousands that I've listened to this year. Before we launch into that top 20, I'm just going to blitz quickly through a reserve list of tracks that I really enjoyed in 2017, but which I didn't feel were quite good enough to get into my top 20. And first off on this list, we have Grillz with Hold On for its very alluring female vocal, its very cacophonous, reverb-esque style of production, and its very simple yet sharp execution throughout the track. Next up, we have Boombox Cartel with Alamo, which possesses a very somber and quietly powerful vocal from Shofi, an expert lead melody, which packs a very fluorescent punch, and a drop that is very haunting with drums that change pace at perfect times in between separate sequences. Next up, we have Chime with Get Your Hands Dirty, which is a wild concoction of zaps, lasers, and very outer-worldly sounds. The dubstep is wide-ranging and extravagant and full of flavour, and beyond that, I love the vocal sample that signals the title of this song. Moving on from there, we have Dustycloud with Bold, which has a very ominous and looming presence to it, a very thought-provoking vocal sample in the build-up to the drop, and a main bass line that has a really good pull to it with surrounding drums timed perfectly to complement that. Following on from there, we have Ketchup with Damn Money, which is a very joyous track full of personality and vigour. It has a vocal sample which is very catchy and easy to sing along to. And I also really liked the juxtaposition here between the build-up, which is quite tense, and the following drops, which are, as I said, much more colourful. Nextly, we have Herobust and MONXX with Giant Squiddim, which is a mix of two completely different styles with a fitting theme to boot. And I think on top of that, this is probably my favourite artwork that I've come across this whole year. Beyond that, if you want to hear my thoughts on this song, I wrote an article on the track when it came out a few months ago. I'll link that in the description below. Next up, we have the weird and wonderful Jace Mek with Conjunct, which is the epitome of a very unique style that I've come to know over the last year or so. It's very strange, but it's very catchy at the same time, bitty but precise. And it just makes a nice change from everything else I've listened to, and to be honest, you just got to embrace the weirdness. Then it's J Robinson with Heiss, which is a very lively and energetic house banger. I love the growls at the drop here, and when coupled with the overlaying pointed notes, it makes for a very nice combination of sounds. And yeah, in general, within this song, I just really like the way that it incorporated more dubsteppy or bro-steppy synths into a house backdrop. Moving on from there, we have Chicken Soup, the collaboration between Skrillex and Habstrakt, and this mixes the comical with some very fantastic production features. It possesses a vocal and a drop which are very catchy and easy to get into, and yeah, it's just a very good song to bop along to, and it very much gets me geared up for anything. Next up, we have Sultan with Sahara, which blows the listener away through the enormity of its sound. I love the way that he contorts all of the synths used in his drops. And yeah, overall, I just think this is another fantastic indicator of how far he's come combining these two completely varied styles. And by that I mean coupling the music from a more Eastern influence with his dubstep prowess, which I pretty sure no one has ever really done before as well as he has done it. Next up, it's Troy Boy with Showbiz, and this is trap of the cheekiest, most intricate form. I love the harmony between the masterful vocal from David Stewart and the very groovy trap backdrop, and I also just think Troy Boy gets right as per the balance between the intensity of the bass and the percussion that he uses to surround that. It's ruddy marvellous. Penultimately, we have Wave Mode with Genji, which couples very appropriate vocal sampling with some robotic growls that bubble away nicely under the surface. It also has some very long, drawn-out snarls at the drop, which repeatedly tug at the listener's mind, whilst also having some shorter paced moments to give the song that much more enthralling atmosphere as it progresses through drop to verse to drop. And to conclude my reserve list for my top 20 singles of 2017, it is Wax Motif and Angels with 5 Alarm, which has very bright, luminous production, yet with quite a dark undertone, and it sets the scene extremely well with a very eerie trap opening. And beyond that, this is almost definitely my favourite vocal of the year, and I wish I knew who it was. If any of you were able to let me know who the vocalist was in that song, then it would be much appreciated. Deep breath. Let's re-energise. And now let's launch into that top 20. Bear in mind that because these songs do rank highly in this list, I'm going to be going into a little bit more detail on them than I did with the reserve songs. Clocking in at the big 2-0, it's my boy Faytal with Helix. This absolute mind melter of a track possesses a very grand introduction with some fantastic drum sequences. A sort of mutant overlord speech eschews its way into the proceedings and is talking about closing the portal and the death of potential people and stuff. I mean, it's not too pretty. However, it certainly paints a picture and very much prepares you for the vomit step that just smacks you in the face. This drop, the sheer incessancy of it, I feel was almost unmatched across the year. There are rippling effects to these acidic growls which certainly leave their mark. As the midsection comes into play, it becomes a little more outer-worldly. And then the second drop arrives and it is just everything of the first drop and more. The way that it trickles in instead of hitting you in the face as hard as the first one did. A lot of artists have tried to do this in the last year or couple of years, and 99% of the time I don't feel it works, but Faytal does it expertly. It's just pure unrelenting filth. At number 19, we have my boy Social Kid with Transmissions. This is certainly one of the more inviting and intriguing introductions I'd heard in a long time. It tells a real story. It is coupled with a rising synth which definitely opens it up into a new world of opportunity. And the pace and staggering of the snares leading up to the drop are perfection. And then the drop comes, and whilst it is one of the most numbing musical experiences I think I've ever had, it's just so good in its simplicity and minimalistic approach because the impact comes from the weight of the sound, the gravitas. And in general, I think Social Kid does really well here in terms of layering different sounds and types of percussion in order to give it that really atmospheric feel as it progresses. For me personally, I'd say it's quite a jarring experience for the listener in the best way possible. Something which is accentuated by the "What Do You Mean" sample that permeates the track. And the last thing I'd love to add about this song is that the reverb in it generally is very well deployed and creates a lovely echoing effect for the song as a whole. The number 18 spot goes to Bones Noize with his song Fire Against Fire. The first few seconds are very glitchy, but this is followed by a very punchy piano introduction. It's extremely alert and on its feet, and this picks up in pace more and more, accelerating towards the drop. And my, is it a drop. This very full and meaty drop sequence is succeeded by something which is much more fast-paced and which also completely flips the song on its head. There is then a brief interlude, which is similar to the introduction, before the second drop comes in, and this spices up things that little bit more because it basically almost entirely replicates the first drop but adds in a few little notes at the beginning to make it that little bit more different. It then proceeds to slam straight back into the fast-paced sequence again, something that I feel could have been worked on a bit. I mean, The sequence is fleshed out that little bit more than the first time around, but not too much has changed. But it's the other parts that I have already talked about that really put this track in the position that it is for me. And whilst this is definitely my favourite track that I've heard of Bones Noize, I very much look forward to what he's got to produce in the future. At number 17, oh god, we're working our way through these, aren't we guys? It's Drezo with Jaded. When it comes to eerie, spooky, moody production, there is no one that matches Drezo. And this opening is exactly what I've come to expect from him. It's empty and it's barren, but in the best way possible because it lends extra presence to everything that is there. As the introduction melts into the build-up, it is signified by a very nice bass sound, which is, honestly, it's spot on. Boom! And from this point onwards, one of the ultimate creators of suspense has a lot of fun formulating what is arguably one of the most chilling instrumentals I've ever heard. And to cap this all off, he puts in a vocal sample which is going, "What's wrong with you? Are you okay?" It honestly couldn't get creepier than this. Like, who is the protagonist talking to? There are no answers, Drezo. There are no freaking answers. I really want to know if this guy who's interrogating this other creature who is unknown to the listener is okay, but I can't find that out before the drop comes. And honestly, Drezo does an incredible job of putting you in this person's position. And about the drop, it's dizzying, it's winding, it's fuzzy, it's brilliant. There are some juicier, simmering notes laying over the top of this grisly backdrop, I suppose, to lure you further into the lair of this creature. But ultimately, everything in this drop is timed very well, even though some of it is slightly inaudible because of the fuzzy sounds. As well as this, there are some gasps of helplessness that put you in the position of the protagonist even more. This unease prolongs itself into the midsection, which is arguably where I feel Drezo must be lauded most. Because to have the patience to create something this empty and this barren of substance is really quite something. Having said that, he still creates and embellishes that extremely tense atmosphere. I honestly don't feel like there's another song this year that paints a picture quite as well as this one does. The jarring piano note in the lead up to the second drop is very much the Volta or the turning point of this song. And it is from here that the hypnosis carries on once more. The second drop is almost identical to the first, but what I love about this is that at the end of this one it signifies the end, making for a very emphatic culmination. Because I feel like having an outro to this song would have given less significance to the midsection and the drop that had just preceded it. And now we are at number 16, people. Number 16. It's a track called Big Bass and it's by Leon Lour. A lot of you might not be too familiar with Leon Lour if you're watching this video and have been enjoying bass-driven electronic dark music over the last couple of years. Because Leon Lour is someone who has usually been producing quite uplifting and happier tunes. And this song is definitely something that opened my mind up to his production even more because it is so vastly different from anything else I've heard of him. This is a bass house track that has quite a muffled introduction but with some very nice surrounding sounds to it. There is then a synth that melts into the track and very much makes itself known. It's quite a statement. It's at this point as the build up increases and intensifies that it becomes much more in your face as an experience. And then this demented vocal sample creeps in and it is none other than grime legend Dizzy Rascal's voice. Car through with a big bass, car through with a big bass, big bass, big bass. He's coming through with a big bass, mate. You better watch out. Lour does brilliantly well here to half the vocal at exactly the right points. And the isolation of the vocal sample in its entirety just before the drop comes around is blissful. As the notes of the drop pound in, they're a perfect mix of something very groovy yet simultaneously dark. The sound is soothing and the direction of the notes is extremely devilish. At each and every point within the drop, Lour knows exactly which part of the vocal sample to use, how long for, and with how much intensity. And even as the song dies down a little after the first drop, the listener knows that they're in for something massive again because of the way in which it resurrects itself, essentially. The groans that squeeze their way into the production and the build-ups in both the first and the second drop complement what comes after it very, very well, creating a relatively uneasy experience, but this doesn't matter much because it is something that is relinquished quickly as soon as the drops arrive. This is just a really thumping, very worth it to listen to track, if that makes sense. Now we turn our attention to number 15, and this one is G Jones with Signal. There's a mind-melting bass line that trickles very well and easily into this track, and there are spooky sounds surrounding this introduction to give it a nice little bit of atmosphere. It is at this point that a higher pitched bass line kicks into action and is very much like an engine being kick-started. There are some snappy snare sounds which are introduced at this point in the build-up, and they are flawlessly timed. And it seems to sort of wind down and start up again at this point, unleashing a drop that is full of metallic, sharp, shiny sounds. It seems like a song where what is continually happening is that it's falling in on itself and then coming back to life. Almost as if too much energy is being exerted in these drops through these really large sounds, so much so that it has to re-energize every few seconds. But yes, overall I think it is just a very stylish myriad of sounds. As the song proceeds, there are more rewind noises and zaps and extraterrestrial sounds that give the song that little bit more of a spacey feel, until this song is finally consigned to its defeat and it can live no longer, and the final vocal sample resonates throughout the track as a whole. This is what you call a dub plate. Drops mic. Moving onward from there, we're at number 14. Doing well, guys, doing well. One of the songs from the collaborative EP between Temanite and Sonar, and this one is Surface Tension. This begins with a classically orchestral opening from Temanite, which is full of grandeur and hope. Drums, strings, horns, you name it. And as soon as Sonar comes into this track, we are once again aware of the fantastic chemistry that these two have between each other. As soon as the seriousness of Sonar's voice becomes increasingly apparent over the top of Temanite's augmenting production, we get a sense as the listener that something heroic is going to happen here. And in this build-up, the multiple chord changes that Temanite goes through are all complemented perfectly by Sonar's own vocal journey. Suddenly, towards the end of the build-up, as Sonar's voice is manipulated a bit, the atmosphere surrounding the track becomes a little bit more tense and uneasy. And it's at this point that it's signified that the song is much heavier than what the introductory sequences had allowed us to think. And then as soon as the drop comes, the listener is treated to a slew of ravenous sides that tear the track up. It's extremely wild music, and yet the musicality of it is so organic and real. Leaves me thinking once again whilst listening to a Temanite track whether there is anyone who does this as well as him. Following on from this rather mighty drop, there is an epic electric midsection during which Sonar seemingly comes back from the dead. And the note selection here is absolutely incredible. First off, there is a return of the pole-banging-esque sounds that had featured in the first drop, but now which come to the front in the second, which I felt was a pretty sweet idea considering that he's not making it too inaccessible in terms of introducing completely new concepts. When the second drop comes around, it's very much just a recycling of sounds that have happened in the first drop. And at the end of this drop, there is another very epic laser sequence to round off what is quite a mind-blowing adventure for the listener. This kind of music is perfect for anyone who really appreciates the more musical and melodic side of dubstep, but doesn't really quite go for the stuff like Seven Lions and Illenium, but to name a couple. And now it is time to move on, ladies and gents, to number 13. And it's at this point that I have to shout out my boys Mike Cervello and the Galaxy for creating possibly the funniest electronic music song I've ever heard. We are introduced once again to Mike Cervello's very manic style as soon as this track starts with a very larger than life production. The intro is a very frantic one with a lot of tribal styles blended into a mix of sirens and horns and very animalistic drum patterns, but the listener is suddenly made aware of something strange going on very quickly. There is a vocal sample that is inserted into the build-up, which is quite frankly one of the most hilarious things I've ever heard in an electronic music song. It's basically a girl telling a story of how this guy comes up to her in a club and asks her what she's doing, and she retorts by sarcastically saying to him, "What do you think I'm doing? I'm having fun later with the DJ." And I won't say exactly what she says, just in case we have any younger viewers out there. But as crude as it is, I cannot deny that it's downright hilarious. This leads on to the drop, which is very much just an accentuated and a heightened version of the build-up and introduction. At this point in the song, the sounds are much more wide-reaching and large and piercing in terms of how exact they are. There is a break in this drop created by a quite petrified vocal sample saying, "Oh my god," which creates a stark contrast between the first half of the drop and the second, in which it's a bit more jungly, bestial, and not as in your face as the previous sequence was. It's at this point that the listener gets a bit of a rest in the midst of the madness before the build-up leads up to the second drop. You can't tell whether something's up or not, because before the vocal sample can say DJ, it's cut off at D, and following that, there's a lovely little vocal sample, which makes me always think of how much MONXX, Cervello and the Galaxy would have enjoyed making this track. It's as if they've put that in and been like, yeah, I know we've made a sick tune, guys. And to be honest, they have. It's a fantastic blend of electric styles of production and something that is genuinely satirical. But anyway, I just love the comical nature of this track and the aliveness of it, and I just think there is much more room in the electronic music scene for satire. On to number 12, and we have the last song from the first of 2 EPs released by this artist under Firepower Records, and that is Mask by Jarvis. This song has straight up one of the most sumptuous leads I've heard within the dubstep realm in recent times. Jarvis does very well here to make his introduction as atmospheric as possible, making the audience feel as if they are in a giant spaceship landing on another planet. And not too long into this track, there are a load of underlying notes which are brought in to make the experience an increasingly intense one. And this is broken somewhat by a vocal sample which is unnerving, yet at the same time extremely vulnerable, and as a listener you're unsure as to which side you sit on in this respect. But this is not something that the listener can dwell on too much, as the tension bubbles more and more under the surface and the build-up becomes increasingly fraught. This owes very much to the quickness of the kicks at this point and the climbing notes which are layered over the top. And then, woy, that drop. I remember hearing this track for the first time and for the few succeeding times after that, and just being completely taken aback by this release. Similarly to other songs that have been discussed previously in this video, it has a very fuzzy aesthetic, making for quite a disorientating experience as one dimension and another dimension are added with the layering that is constantly happening as this drop progresses. There are screeches and interjecting stabs that are inserted midway through to make sure that this track ticks along very nicely, before Jarvis embarks on a very trance-esque interlude owing to the style of the sounds, and then kicking straight back into the drop, which is yet another very unexpected but welcomed thing in this song. This time, however, the overall sound is even fuzzier than before, and the notes are of a higher octave, so it makes for an even more winding experience, and it's just something that is being built on all the time before it finally breaks down. It's at this point that we are reintroduced to the introduction as we lead on towards the second drop, and this is a moment of absolute savagery, brutality, ferocity even. A whirlwind of snarls and growls that rip at the mind of the listener and leave them even more dumbfounded than they were before. But this is a fantastic thing because it's playing with the mind of the audience and very much leaving it up to them to guess what happens next, because it's completely unknown. This track is so on its feet and alert in terms of the directions that it's going in. By its culmination, it has fizzled down nicely and deconstructed in a quite effortless way. And this is mirrored fantastically by the final "When I See Your Face" vocal sample, which fades off and echoes blissfully into the distance as shadows somewhat of its former self. At number 10, we have Aero Chord, Resistance. From the start of this track, this is quite simply vintage from the Greek producer. The horns and the jagged main feature and the intricate percussion, I mean, yeah, it's just classic. It's a very grand, statement-making horn section that follows this, and the percussion trickles back in beautifully with a very demented seeming vocal sample bubbling away in the corner. This then leads up towards a drop, which is an absolute explosion of sound. Unbelievably thumping kicks and a twisted vocal sample. What's not to like? In the middle of this drop there is a trap breakdown which seems to slow down the vocal sample even though it's at the same speed, but what this does is just articulate it more. And it was here that I realised that this song is very much just a collection of short bursts of preparation for much more emphatic sequences that follow directly afterwards. And it makes generally for a very nice juxtaposition within the track as a whole, between the stuff that is a bit more carnivorous and then the stuff that is more slowed down, asking the reader to take a step back from it and observe this sort of makeup of these particular sounds a little bit more. I can't move on from talking about the track breakdown without discussing the screeches that happen within that part. They're just so well executed in terms of the brevity of them and when he chooses to lengthen them out a little bit more. It's very artsy indeed. The horn section is then on hand to return again whilst the marching drums kick back into action. And as this build-up gathers pace towards the second drop, the listener is made aware of a new screeching sound that is teasing itself into its surrounding environment. And this is very much a case of, well, if you thought the first drop was big, then the second is even bigger. These screeches are now at the forefront and they're all overlapping each other, and it's just a real mishmash of really exciting sounds. It's just so large and outlandish. Once again, at this part of the song, everything is timed to perfection and placed in exactly the right places. There is then another breakdown where Aero chord goes off in a very trappy direction, and this is when the lasers really come to the fore and zap everything in their path. Taking all of this into consideration, it's quite something to me how Aero chord manages to bring this track back down to some sort of standpoint, and this can only be a sign of the expert qualities that Aero chord possesses as a producer of electronic music. If you have stuck with this video until now, I really appreciate it. It's certainly a long one, but this thing is about to be taken to a whole new level, because this is Naughty Step's top 10 favourite singles of 2017. And clocking in at number 10 is a dubstep or brostep artist that I'm not too sure many of you will have heard of. He has produced mostly for the Drop It Network and Gutter Records, and he has even changed his moniker in recent times, which may make you even more unsure as to who this artist is. But, ladies and gentlemen, this artist is Heiss, and the song I'm going to be talking about is Destroyed. There are a plethora of deep drums and a general moodiness that makes you feel as if you're about to go into battle. This is until a vocal sample comes in that is adamant that the human race will not be destroyed, and it becomes clear after this vocal sample and going into this build-up that whilst it has quite a simple structure, it's certainly telling a story and doing so very well. The listener is then made aware of some quite rowdy growls which squeeze their way into the production of the build-up. This leads into the drop expertly because it gives a small snippet of what we're going to expect in the drop without giving too much away. And it's at this point that we are reminded of the title of the song through a small chunk of the vocal sample saying "destroyed" just before hell is unleashed. And this is just utter destruction and annihilation. This to me is bombastic brostep at its finest. The note placement is just so ridiculously on point, but the greatness of this drop for me lies even more in the choice of the sounds, which are so dynamic and wide-reaching. This is made clearer at a half drop following on from the first drop, where the snarls are isolated to emphasise their veracity somewhat. And once again, there's just an incredible attention to detail here in terms of the volume and the timing and the placement of all the snarls and growls that have their place within this drop. Everything just bounces and rebounds off each other really nicely. The track then seems to melt away a little bit at some point, but it revives itself with another daunting, brooding build-up. It leads into the drop in a very similar fashion to how it did in the first, and yeah, I'll have the same again please mate. And this is in reference to the second main drop, which, whilst it is very similar to the first drop, I can't complain. I just absolutely love the consistency of this track. And what I would say is that Heiss does very well at this point to end the song abruptly. It gives a much more lasting impact to everything that has happened before it. I'm just looking forward to what this guy's going to produce in the future. I mean, whilst he might have quite simple structures, his sounds are very purposeful and aspiring. That accuracy that he has with the note placement, it just gets to me. At number 9, It is the dubstep mega master, maestro, legend, whatever you want to call him, and that is Zomboy with his track Young and Dangerous. Now, it took me a while to decipher which song from his Rotten Roll EP I liked best, but I came to this conclusion because it was very much for the dubstep that I was listening to Zomboy's music in the first place. And for me, the best sounding dubstep in that EP comes in this song. Our senses are summoned by a very mellow piano introduction, something which Zomboy has become somewhat renowned for in previous years. Just so dreamy, man, so freaking dreamy, dude! Kato's voice comes into play not long after and very much holds the piano up, also backed at the same time by a load of surrounding strings which create quite a summery vibe. And it's only when the strings sort of stretch further in terms of their reach and the drums kick in that a different tone is adopted by the song entirely. From the moment the introduction ends, the build-up really starts to kick in and the drums are used in full force. And we are told over and over in the build-up that we are young, 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 young. But the emphasis is in fact on the word dangerous, which comes just before the drop, and a massive shriek. This makes it horrifying, evil, yet oh so good in its delivery. The drop that follows it is about as menacing and visceral and grating as it gets, and in the best way possible. Zomboy just does such a fantastic job here of throwing the listener in one direction then another. It's just so fantastically sinewy. It's always changing up, it's always providing new avenues to go down. And this is what Zomboy has become renowned for in the last 4 or 5 years. Keeping the listener constantly on their feet, but leaving them wanting more all the time. And whilst this is all going on, with all the crazy amalgamation of sounds that there still pertains to be such an incredible clarity to it. I'm left baffled by this level of production, seriously guys, I can't keep up with it. It's definitely worth noting, moreover, that in this mid-section, shout out Kato, because this is my favourite part of her vocal. Forget about the undertone. We're going where we shouldn't go. Oh, it's just so beautiful. But returning to the darker side of this track, there are some arcade-like notes that fill up the build-up towards the second drop. And this just makes for an even more animated trajectory as the song goes from one idea to another, relentlessly. The second drop does extremely well to hold the attention of the listener because it changes it up by having notes that are a bit more staggered, but it has parts within those staggered sections which are much more quick paced, so it's once again leaving the listener constantly questioning as to what's going to happen next. What I would say is that there is an aspect of the outro that is a bit too poppy for my liking, and which has definitely prevented me from placing it higher in this list. But returning to the fullness of the vocal right at the culmination of the track is a fantastic decision made by Mr. Melody himself. And the ending sample of "We're killing it right now" is, similarly to the Mike Cervello track, a sort of indicator for the level to which he thinks he's made a banger, and he knows he's made a banger. As I said, this is probably my favourite from his Rotten Roll EP, but that's not to say I didn't enjoy the other ones a lot. You know, maybe those are some ideas that you're gonna have to watch out for in another video in the future. But moving on, we are now at number 8, people. This one is much more chilled, but that doesn't mean that I like it any less. It's just an entirely different vibe to everything I have discussed already and everything that I'm going to discuss afterwards. And this is the final track from Tasoki's Time Travel EP entitled Haunted by You. If you're looking for a very pretty and hazy and ethereal opening few seconds to a song, then you'll be hard pressed to find anything better than this. As this dissipates somewhat, there is a rasping female vocal that sears its way into the track. And whilst this is an undeniably fragile figure that is delivering these words, she also seems extremely daring because she is speaking her mind. And this conflict between these differing emotions within this voice is definitely something that drives this song forward from start to finish. Once this vocal sample has been done once and is restarting, the percussion picks up a little bit and gives the track that little bit more cognition. And a sort of high-pitched vibration sound occupies the space in the backdrop and is very much brought to the attention of the listener, becoming more and more colourful as it edges its way towards the drop. Overall, the percussion is very poignant and precise at this point, but it's in particular the cicada sounds which get me going. They just ignite the awareness of the listener even more than everything else, in my opinion. This carries through into the drop, which is very much just a way of intensifying that mellow background sound that had been growing in colour in the lead up to the drop. This comes to the forefront of the song, and it's something that is drawn out and stretched as the second drop comes into play. Whilst it may be quite high pitched as a sound, it's still a little bit muffled to make it accessible for any listener. This is very much a melancholic song, something which becomes apparent towards the end when the female voice becomes demented and twisted somewhat. This person is just seeking clarity. I mean, she says that she just wants the truth, but her overriding feeling is that she's being haunted. And it makes for a very heart-wrenching listening, but sometimes that's what music is there to do. And whilst this song isn't necessarily dark in its delivery, in the synths that it uses, and especially for a bro step artist such as Tasoki, its message possesses that gloomy undertone, so that is where this song gets its darkness from. It just winds down in a really lovely, soothing way. And yeah, it's just a fantastic contrast from everything else that is in this list. Now we must move on once more to number 7. And at number 7, it's your vocal trap mastermind, Volpetron 9000, Mr. Ray Volpe with Rescue Me. Once again, Volpe creates a very scenic introduction where the kicks are effective, the claps are timed to perfection, and the musicality is idyllic. The vocal sample Rescue Me is always cut off by "is that," which makes me feel like this is a cry for help and realization of who's out there, but they can't quite reach that person to help them. As the build up towards the drop gathers momentum, there is a vocal murmur that emerges from the depths. And a couple of years ago I placed Volpe's remix of No Applause's Runnin' as my #1 remix of the year because it was a sound once more that I had never heard of before and was completely alien to before coming across that track. And upon listening to that again and again, I never thought that that style could be added to or improved really just because it was so good. And yet Volpe comes through here and takes it once again to another level with a vocal trap masterclass that, whilst quite estranging and hard to make sense of, is extremely gripping. Rescue na hunna na rescue na hunna. I mean, if you haven't listened to the song, give it a listen and let me know if my impression was a good one. It's at this point where the vocal has very much disintegrated and become morphed and manipulated that the rescue seems out of reach. Yet still, in the midst of this dreariness and seeming misery, it sounds so good. The growls in the middle of these drops are also vintage Ray Volpe. They do very well to seize the attention of the listener before the music blasts back into action. And this is most apparent halfway through the verse drop when we are confronted with this absolute wall of sound, a verbal attack of blistering proportions. The vocal is chopped up and given a much quicker pace, which just gives it that extra bit of life really. And it's because of this sequence that it's quite a come down where we are returning back to the introduction and setting up and re-energizing again in preparation for the second drop. There's quite a melancholic vibe with the vocal notes chosen, and it creates quite a dreamy essence, I'd say, to the song, with the vocal notes chosen here creating quite a melancholic vibe, backed up by the strings and all the different chords that are joining together in this moment. It makes for a fantastic setup for what's about to come. But this drop does not come before the build-up, in which there is a vocal sample, rock to the rhythm, rhythm, ha, which is repeated more and more until the drop comes along in the build-up, and it just gives it that extra little bit of naughtiness, to be honest with you. Yeah, he's just made it proper naughty there. And this second drop, whilst similar in its design and its idea, it's very much a mutation of the first drop. It's a mishmash of quite inaudible sounds, but which join forces to make quite an interesting product. Once again, we have the drop being fastened up to give it that extra bit of life and spice. And this is before it very much unravels itself and dissolves and dissipates into oblivion. And again, akin to some of the other tracks I've discussed already, it's just a fantastic way of really deconstructing all the different elements that have taken part in that song and allowing the listener to reflect on everything that's just happened, with an ending that is really quite slow and well timed and well thought of in comparison to the absolute carnage that has come before it. Now we at number 6. It's two artists that are not in the complete mainstream of the dubstep scene, and honestly that I have loved for the last couple of years and that I had hoped would collaborate. And so it was to my joy that Two Vein and Mastodon worked together to produce Doomsday. We are blinded by lies. This vocal sample comes right at the beginning of the song, and it is so pertinent. God! We are living in a world right now that is absolutely enveloped in the idea of fake news, and just hearing this sort of demonic overlord talk over the very haunting backdrop really reminded me of the powers that be at this moment in time. Again, maybe I'm reading too much into it, but I just found it really quite meaningful. But yes, back to the music, and there is a very warlike image being painted here. There's a thumping build-up which is incredibly emphatic and grandiose. And then BOW! Out of nowhere! Wowzers! Oh my gosh, this was all that I had wished for and more. A multitude of growls and screams, all well managed and paced efficiently and with purpose. Some extremely elastic and very wonky sound design, all of which is coated by these really booming vocal samples which really just give it that extra mighty dimension. Towards the end of the first drop it gets particularly wild, and there was something originally about this structure that I didn't warm to, but which I've definitely come to love over time because of the sheer crazy ambition that is being shown here by these two artists that is just difficult not to appreciate for lovers of the dubstep genre. As this dies down a little, the ruin of the first drop is made clear to us as the picture is painted and the song essentially starts once more. The following drop, oh my word! This is almost for me as hard hitting as it gets. Irrespective of death step and heavy metal step, I think within the dubstep, brostep genre, yeah, this is some serious stuff. It pounds and then it winds up and down and back again, and it's just all so well controlled despite how crazy it is. The twangy synths from the first drop then return to the second drop to give that bit of familiarity amongst all of the variation that we've witnessed beforehand. And it's just one hit after another, and another, and another, and another. It then fades off somewhere into the distance to give me the lasting impression, at least, that it's just going out to wreak even more havoc than it has done already. Number 5! We're at the top 5! We're at the top 5! Here is my favourite song from an EP that I grew to love more and more as the months went on in 2017. It was one of the most wide-ranging and ambitious projects that I'd heard in a while, but that's a discussion for another video. And the song that I'm going to be discussing for my 5th place song from my favourite singles of 2017 is Blueprint by Dr. Ozzy. This is another one of those very dreamy, soothing openings, with a very moving, playful vocal sample layered over the top. For the rest of vibe, for the rest of vibe. This becomes hectic over a short period as the vocal sample is played with in the background in a multitude of ways. The build-up is pretty standard, but I think it puts us in a good position to appreciate the drop when it comes. And once again, it is an absolute tub thumper. Pump your fist in this! Which I must say is up there with my favourite vocal samples at the moment. Shout out Quicks as well for using that in Lucy's place. A quite squelchy synth blasts its way into the track, which is quite staggered and then quite skitterish. The way that this sort of opens the door for the original vocal sample to come in and have its own say, all of the while all these other sounds are coming together to make up this really meaty sound. It just all coheres so well. It gets increasingly more jumpy and experimental as the drop goes on. And similarly to the Zomboy song, it's just really quite crazy to think of how many different elements there are just to make up one single sound. The track then breaks down a little into a very graceful midsection where all the elements are starting to come together again. And then the second drop, wow-wee! This scattergun placement of all these very edged notes is just so well done because nothing is out of place even through all of this experimentation and variation that it goes through in this second drop. It's as if he had an idea at every 3 or 4 seconds of this part of the song and was just willing to take every very small idea that he had to the next level. There's a complexity, but yet it's so vivid and clear in your mind when you're listening. There is then a moment just before the song's end where we have the vocal chopping but without the musicality, isolating it and giving it that importance and significance within the song itself. And as the song draws to a close, the drums seize the listener for one last bout of absolute magicness from Mr. Ozzy himself. We at number 4. Do you want some more? I'll take that as a yes. It's DJ Blend with Infamous Rebellion. This is big room, this is mighty, this is larger than life. The introduction actually sounds somewhat like something that Far Too Loud would do, which I suppose says a lot. The vocal sample of Bitch Better Have My Money reverberates throughout the track from the start, as the vocal is chopped more and more in the build up towards the drop. Bitch better have, bitch better have. This is some of the best sounding growls I've heard in a long time, and especially in a bass house song as opposed to a dubstep or bro step track. It's just such a fantastically wild tune. It really gets you going. Straight up, fiery, flamey bass house right up in your face. And it's not just the growl that takes centre stage, it's everything that surrounds it. From the bellowing percussion to the more quirky and chirpy, insect-like sounds that are laced throughout this track. And that's in a house song. That isn't a dubstep song. Come on guys, this is freaking incredible. It's almost not as much that I love this song that I find it impossible to dislike it. There is a breakdown in the first drop which is mirrored moreover in the second drop, in which there are these really drawn out belches that really, oh man, they're so good. It's as if you're in the middle of the room where all the walls are occupied by surround sound. Another one of Naughty Step's impressions coming at ya. This is a thrilling sequence of growls and huge wubs that possess a lot of variety. This is all quelled until a huge vocal sample saying, "Can you feel it?" finds its way in the track, and this beautiful trumpet melody just crashes straight through. And the second drop, whilst you couldn't listen to it without the context of the first one, it's just as good. There's a kind of recycling of the sounds to put them in different places, draw them out longer. It's just lovely to get that variation but with the same exact sounds. We are then reintroduced to the maddening, belching, growling sequence before then being reintroduced to the trumpet section, which is just so epic. Just really gargantuan production. I think you'd be hard pressed to find a bigger sound than this. The thing I love most about this song is that it has several really top ideas and they all cohere effortlessly. Having said that, the only drawback I have with this song is that some of the EQing in the transitions between these ideas could have been a little cleaner. But overall, this is an absolute grade 1 banger. I couldn't recommend it more. Number 3! Number 3! Number 3! Number 3! It's everyone's favourite dubstep German, Mr. Virtual Riot, with the title track from his Throwback EP. Extremely inviting opening melody here from Virtual Riot. You can just tell it's him straight away from the extremely vibrant, high definition, and I want to say plump style of production that he has. It is oh so juicy. You are being invited straight away right into his animated world. He is then quick to introduce some vocal chopping, which I must admit is very reminiscent of early Skrillex. It's that playful and sprightly and experimental. And from this point until the drop, Virtual Riot amasses an absolute mountain of sounds to ensure that the impact between that point and the break and the drop is as strong as it can be. And it really, really is, because whilst it builds up so much, it has this tiny little drum sequence like that, and it's only at that point that the full weight of the drop can be felt. And it is a perfect match between these really robotic snarls and growls and these really blissful chords. That alone is enough to set up this track as a truly fantastic one. It's got the drawn out synths, it's got the shimmering ones, it's got the straight up lasers hitting you directly in the face. I mean, it's just got so much to offer. There's almost so much going on that I can't keep up, but that isn't the case simply because the ebb and flow of it is so precise. We then proceed towards a somewhat quieter version of the preceding events, And this very calming midsection is somewhat reminiscent of the remix that Virtual Riot did with Kill the Noise for the Occult Classic remix album. Very intricate, very utopian, just so nice to listen to. And this, again, is what makes this song, and to be honest, that EP in general so good, is just that clear contrast between the playful side of Virtual Riot and the really grisly side of him. Following on from that, we have the second drop, which, whilst it is almost entirely similar to the first, I'm not complaining because I can listen to that again and again and again. The only significant difference I'd say is that it just keeps getting bigger and bigger. It builds on the original idea that it have, and this is mostly done through the percussion. I genuinely say this is one of the songs that has empowered me most in recent times. It's got them good feels, but it's also got them naughty feels. Number 2. Exciting. May I talk about an artist that I've really come to love over the last year or two? That is PhaseOne.
And stupidly enough, I forgot to mention the title of the track, but it is Welcome to Mayhem.
Let's just jump straight into this one because it's pretty short but incredibly sweet. A very gripping introduction which, whilst quite simple in its structure, does incredibly well to paint a picture and set a scene. It's another dubstep or brostep song from this list that really invites you to bop along to it as the build-up comes towards the drop. And I think it's worth noting that this music would be defined as heavy metal step rather than dubstep or brostep for the way that it combines different styles together. Because as we hit the drop, this vocal from In Heart's Wake is just so fitting for the backdrop that it lays on top of. It's ferocious and it's ravenous, and it is just leaving absolutely nothing in its wake. Or in Heart's Wake, you might say. The drop is extremely guttural and visceral, swallowing you whole and throwing you straight back up again, and you just have to immerse yourself in the sheer heaviness of this energy. Throughout the drop it bamboozles but retains its scintillating format. It's just quite a mesmeric bringing together of heavy metal and dubstep to create this completely bewildering experience for the audience. There are some huge plosive sounds followed by some very staggered synths to give it that bit more of a jarring edge. And as I said, this song is quite short, and what I meant by that was that it follows a ritual of having something emphatic, getting on with that quickly, rebuilding then again quickly, and going straight back into something even heavier than before. PhaseOne changes up the second drop by staggering the beginning of the first drop a little bit, and this allows the listener to reflect momentarily on the sheer immensity of this track. It's at this point that I think one realises quite how significant the drums are in this song. They're very rich in variation and placement and volume, and I just think that they do very well to set up everything that follows them. And in short, this is just a very sweet unification of very differing elements. There's just so much to feast one's ears on. And I think it's worth mentioning that considering this track came out right at the start of 2017, that it stood the test of time, and it was one of the first songs I went to listen to every time I started listening to my music on my phone. I just think that says a lot basically for how good a track this is.
Number 1! Number 1! This the number 1!
Number 1! Big sleeve roll up. I'm now coming to a song which I think is quite simply, more than anything, a fantastic idea. Although it may not move me emotionally to the extent that some of the other tracks on this list do, I think in terms of it being a concept, of it being something clever and witty and experimental to do with this type of music, for me this song was unparalleled this year. And that song, I don't think a lot of people will be surprised to know, was Alpha Dogs by Lektrique and aUtOdiDakT. This thing has one of the most infectious leads I have ever heard. Wow, 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 wow. Yeah, that's right. Just so in your face. So many little vocal samples here and there flying off. A little a little whoop, a little This is before I've even mentioned the extremely intricate and dainty percussion that surrounds all of these vocal samples. This carries on in a very measured way until it breaks down into another massive vocal sample. And then I did the damn thing. Hoorah! It's just so wacky and bonkers and mad. Oh, it's so brilliant. But little did I know when listening to this for the first time that I was nowhere near the best part, because the entire point of this song is revealed to us in yet another vocal sample just before the drop. And the vocal sample says, yeah, that's alpha dog sound. And this is succeeded by a drop that is made up of dogs barking. Dogs barking! How cool is that? Even through this natural sound, Lektrique and aUtOdiDakT find a way to make it robotic and grisly and very listenable for the standard dubstep, brostep or bass house listener. Very shiny, very modern, very metallic synths being used here. Everything ties together so well. Within the first drop, there's a half drop in which the barks speed up quickly at one point. And yeah, just the timing of that is spot on. It's something that kickstarts the drop once again, you know, even as if it needed it. This goes on towards a midsection in which other dogs, different types of dogs, different barks come into play. The listener is then taken on a very spiralling journey in which everything seems to melt upwards. And this makes for a very frazzling experience. But a good one in preparation, knowing that what's going to come next is probably going to be as good, if not better. Because it's an idea that is just so good to play with. And as expected, the second drop is as absorbing and captivating as the first, yet it is completely different. It then changes from this bass house trappy sort of vibe to a more bass house glitchy vibe. The barks are relinquished a little for a more zapping laser sounds that come into the fore at this point in the song. And as the song goes on, these gain in intensity and differ in their placement and volume and pitch, whilst other dog barking sounds come into the track. It's just amazing how much you can do with production regardless of what synths you have on top of that, and Lektrique and aUtOdiDakT exploit that perfectly here. There's a real patience and attention to detail here with regards to where everything is placed and all the samples that surround those things. Considering that, it does extremely well to wind down and in some ways deconstruct itself and bring it to its bare bones. And it wasn't as if they weren't going to leave us with one last vocal sample to really grab the attention. Who's the alpha dog now? Followed by 4 really gnarly barks. That, for me alone, is one of the moments of the year. But yeah, Alpha Dogs is a fantastic concept. It's full of variety, so wild in its production style, and it has some truly amazing vocal samples, of which there are many. And in that respect, I just couldn't complain about any aspects of this song. And to be honest, I didn't expect something as massive from 2 artists that I wasn't too sure on before this song. But hey, this is what happens when you bring 2 minds together. They can create something bigger than themselves. I will be returning to this song many, many, many times in the coming years. And so that concludes my top 20 originals of 2017. Thank you to everyone that has watched this, those that have stayed till the end, or those that have even watched a little bit of it. I'd love to know what you guys think of this selection, and if you have your own top 20, top 15, top 10, whatever, then leave it in the comments section below. Let's get the discussion going. It would be great to see which kind of genres and artists you guys are into. Don't forget, as I mentioned at the start of this video, that this is just one opinion. I'm not saying anything objective about these tracks. These are just the ones that I like the most of 2017. So yeah, thanks for watching this video, and I hope to see you at the next one, which will be my top 20 remixes of 2017. And remember, if it's naughty, then you know. Peace!